Welcome to this Fireside chat with Caesar Sengupta. We're so lucky to have him to share his career development, successes, stories, learnings over the past couple of decades. And what I'm going to do now is just share a little bit about the Zoogla community for a few seconds before introducing Caesar. And we're going to do a fireside chat with him. I've got some questions that you've submitted. I'll go through that, but please feel free to type out your questions. I'll go through that near the end. We'll probably also open up the mic near the end as well. So feel free to start typing up your questions you have for Caesar. So for those who don't know, the Zoogla community, we've been around since 2015. Clearly, there have been many Zooglas who've left Google since even the early days, but really this rendition started in about 7-8 years ago. And what we've had was people like Kushagra and other folks come together, say, let's bring the community together, learn from folks like Caesar. We've had such a great learning experience inside Google. When we leave, let's bring the community, have people be helpful to each other, gather together. And right now we have over 300 events a year, all organized by volunteers who are Zooglas or Googlers all around the world. We have meetups like this. We have co-founder matching days. We have people that actually want to hire from the community. So we have events around that, but also we have demo days. And we even have a venture capital fund to help Zooglas who are leaving Google start their own thing. So reach out if you have any questions with that. Happy to share more about that later. So why don't we go to talk about Caesar? Many of you worked for him, worked alongside him and know him, but I want to do a quick intro about him. And as you heard from Hitesh and other folks, he is the CEO and co-founder of Arborworks. He's based in Singapore, but also in Mountain View too for his stealth fintech startup. He won't be focused on talking about it today, but we'll probably hear about it more in the next few months, next couple of years. But he wanted to give back to the community and share what he's learned from his time at Google, before Google, but also since he's left Google. And hopefully some of you will be able to learn a bit from him. He previously was a VP and GM of payments and the Next Billion User initiative there. And some highlights over there is also a Google Pay. He led it to achieve over 150 million monthly active users across 30 countries. During his 15 years there, he's also helped with multiple acquisitions and strategic investments, including Gojek, the Indonesian company, but also Indian startups, Glance, Dunzo, and Reliance. We also, as we had mentioned earlier, he was responsible and helped start and lead the Chrome OS team. And all of you have Chromebooks. We have him to thank, his leadership over there. He graduated with an MS in computer science from Stanford and an MBA at the Wharton School. So thank you again, Caesar, for taking the time out today to talk about career development. And so why don't we just start about your earliest point in your career? You studied at Stanford, but also during the dot-com boom, did an internship at HP Lab. Can you share more about those times? And what was it like also being at a startup got acquired by IBM during those post-dot-com boom times?
Yeah, it was actually quite fun, and it was sort of heady days at Stanford. At that point, it was almost customary to drop out for at least a semester, a quarter, and try doing a startup. Like you had professors who would find interesting project and be willing to, invest and get things going. And it was one of those things that made the Silicon Valley so incredibly fun to be in at that time. I think we've had similar periods, ebbs and flows. We're probably right now in a bit of a ebb, but the last few years were sort of similar for Web3, at least in the Valley and elsewhere. But it was just one of those times it was full of possibility and we could do a lot. I wasn't quite sure about whether I wanted to do a PhD or not. So I'm actually really glad I ended up at HP Labs trying to try out industrial research in computer science research, but then, ended up staying in the more professional sphere rather than in academia.
Great. And during that time, you went into a startup, we got acquired. Did you stay at IBM for long, or did you essentially apply to go to Wharton immediately after that?
No, so actually, talking about my career, for those of you who know me, know my career, I've bounced across different countries a while. So the reason for that had nothing to do actually for career reasons. It's actually got to do with one specific person who I've now been married to for 20 years, but we met at grad school, and she was on a bond with the Singapore government and had to come back to Singapore. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept, like Singapore gives these scholarships, sends high schoolers to the US, UK, other places, but they need to come back and work for the government. So my wife was one of those, and so I worked in the Valley for about a year, and then had to choose between career and this person. And I think 20 years later, I can happily say I made the right call and I moved to Singapore and joined a startup. We got married. I was here for a while. Then she was in the foreign service, so we got transferred to London. When her bond finished was when I moved back to the Bay Area. And at some point during that, I ended up at Google. The primary reason actually I ended up going to business school, because it's a question lots of people asked me. So I was an engineer for the first part of my career, classic backend server-side engineer, Java engineer. But I started getting much more interested in sort of the overall aspect of how a company is run. And one of the great things that had happened for me when I moved to Singapore was I joined a startup. And this is one of those things that startups are amazing for. There's so much work, nobody tells you not to do something. So my founder let me work on marketing, a bit on sales, all sorts of stuff. And I realized I really enjoyed sort of the very broad scope, even though engineering was where I had spent most of my time, and in a way that sort of prepares you very well for a product role in a company like Google or something. So my desire to go to business school was more to sort of round out my education and learn a lot about different aspects of running a company. The funny thing was, I thought I would join after business school. I would basically join a big tech company, learn about how to build products, find a good group of people to work with, and then leave and start my own company. That was my plan. And if you had asked me in 2006 when I wanted to leave, I would have said 2 years. And since then, every year, I basically said I'll leave in a couple of years. I found a great group of people. The funny thing was I found a great group of people at Google, but I ended up doing multiple products with them and didn't end up leaving for 15 years. So I was almost at a stage where I was like, if I don't do it now, I'm never going to be able to do it. So it was one of those things where, the business school was a stepping stone to essentially getting to building a company.
That's awesome. It sounds like you were able to work with a great set of people at Google, and then clearly now your own company. Let's go back a little bit during the time at Wharton. There's some people here maybe early in their careers. Would you recommend them to go to business school? And when you also did an internship at Standard Chartered for your own perspectives, or that was just rounding out your business career and you didn't want to stay in tech?
Yeah. So I think the question about should people go to business school has come about many times. I would say it makes sense if you feel like it'll help round out sort of your skill set. But if you're in a startup where you have the ability to jump into multiple things and really get deep into it, you'll actually learn equally fast. And even within sort of a large company like Google, if you're on a project where you have the ability to move around and you're on a team that's supportive, of letting people move around and switch roles and things like that, then you don't really need to go to business schools. Not to pick on Ben, but because I see him on the screen, Ben started off on Chrome OS in marketing. At some point, he decided he wanted to learn more about product. He did a rotation. He really enjoyed it. He proved that he was actually a really good product manager, and then started doing PM. And we've seen that happen from engineers, from others. So I think one of the big advantages of a large company like Google or a startup is that you can get that ability to switch and learn about other skills that kind of makes the business school a little bit moot.
That makes sense. And just based on your prior answer, it did seem that you did want to join a big tech company after business school. And tell us about your road into Google. Did you have Stanford friends already at Google, or how did you end up there?
Yeah. So I think I should go back a little bit to Stanford. I had one criteria when I was going to business school, because I was in the US. I had to get back to London because my wife was there. As I said, all my career questions are actually not great career questions to ask, because they're all largely dictated by what my wife wanted to do at that point of time. And not that she had a lot of choice, she was kind of bound by her bond. So I just had to get back to London. And so Standard Chartered was literally in a way it was in London. It was a summer. The funny thing was I ended up hating banking, and I was doing a consulting role in the bank. I hated consulting. So I effectively ruled out 80% of the jobs that come out of business school. So in a way, like my going and talking to Google was just a sort of backup. My advisor at Stanford was Larry Page's advisor, Marissa's advisor. So a bunch of my friends and classmates from Stanford were already at Google. So I was actually basically talking to a whole bunch of these people while I was going through this process and saying, I don't want to do banking. I don't want to do bank consulting. So I ended up talking to Google. And because of my background as an engineer with a business degree, it was a fairly straightforward path to being a PM. So that's how I landed up at Google in London as a PM.
I'm just curious, like, because you worked for so many years, you made such good progress. What keeps you going now? I'm guessing initially it's promotions, those type of things, but later on in life, is it different, or is it how can I grow something big, or is it like how can I give back to the community, make it useful for a lot of people?
I don't know if this is the answer you're looking for, but or it might sound like I've not ever actually been particularly into promotions. And I think I was very fortunate to have been at Google at a time where you didn't have to think much about promotions or perf. And so what's always kept me going in a way at Google and even now is I have this sort of belief that I'm going to have one life. I kind of don't want to be 80 and look back and feel like I've done nothing of value. I want to kind of be 80 and look back and say, you know, like, oh, wow, I had a role to play in these set of things. And so I think even when I was at Google very early on, like I ended up drifting into projects which were kind of crazy. Like when we started Chrome OS, you know, Windows was like 95% share, Mac was 5% share. And a whole bunch of people said, this is the stupidest thing to do is to build a new operating system, right? And today Chrome OS is number 2. Windows is still obviously the majority, but in certain segments, like, you know, you'd only find Chromebooks. And so it was one of those very high risk things. It could have gone off badly, but the way, you know, a number of us, it's not just me, like I'm very fortunate that a lot of my co-founders at Arbo are very similar. We all looked at it and said, yeah, we'll, you know, likelihood that we'll fail, but if we succeed, this is something we'll look back on forever. And, you know, that's kind of what got us going. And even in the same way, when we were doing NBU and Next Billion Users, right? And Ben is here. Ben started on NBU on day -5. You know, before it was NBU, we named it together. He can talk about it too. It was similar. Like we were like, no, Google has always focused on the US. It's never going to turn its attention outside. We're never going to be able to build a product that's not being built in Mountain View. But we ended up building a number of products that were not built in Mountain View outside because we felt like, hey, if we manage to pull this off and we'll give it the best we can, it's just going to be so epic. And so that's sort of how I've run my career and I know Google today, like people really have to manage perf and all that kind of stuff. But my weird advice almost is like, it's a freaking waste of time. Like the better thing to do is to do that what really excites you and gets you out of bed every single morning.
Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing that.
But I do also realize that, you know, it sounds very privileged to be able to say it once kind of, you know, you're at my stage in the career.
Makes sense. So thank you for that, Caesar. Like, this is Kirsch. I'm gonna take over on behalf of Chris. By the way, Ben, so good to see you. You have 2 Indian boys here with a man crush on you. So for those of you who don't know, Ben and I were on the same APMM promotion, and we went on this crazy trip to Europe, Russia, and Kenya together. And I think we shared a hotel room too. So Caesar, I think one of the key aspects that I've loved about Great PM, by the way, I work with your fellow PM, Raghu at FalconX now. So one of the things that inspired me the most about looking at Great PM is what daily and weekly habits do you form? There's a lot of discipline that is required to eventually find greatness. Can you talk a little bit about like what are some of those like formative things that you realize are extremely important for have a tremendous career as a product manager?
Yeah. So I still feel I'm on a journey to become a good product manager and become much more effective. But I can talk a little bit about somebody that I watched a lot and I still try to emulate, which was my manager then, but currently like our Google CEO Sundar, right? One of the things that made Sundar really amazing was literally every day, if you walk around, you'll see Sundar carrying a small piece of paper. And he'd have like 3 or 4 things that he wanted to get done on that sheet. And people on his team all knew that if your thing was not on that sheet, Sundar would not think about it. Like he would prioritize very, very ruthlessly. And so that's something that I've always tried to copy. So even now, like on a weekly basis, I'll basically say, what are the key things that I absolutely need to drive? What decisions do I need to close? Or what things do I need to make sure it gets to the next stage this week? Or, this day gets very hard to do. Day is more about tasks that you just clear out. But at a weekly level, basically saying this week, how do I move? Like right now, for example, I'm like, what are the key things that need to move forward for Arbo in the next week? And then those are the ones that I'll try to like make sure I focus on and clear out, even though there's lots of noise and everything else calling for attention.
That's amazing. Caesar, can you also talk a little bit about who are some of the other PM leaders that you are inspired by and some of their attributes?
Sundar obviously was phenomenal. I think a couple of others who are really, really good. I'll give 2 examples. One is Brian Rakowski, who was a PM for Chrome. Now I think he's PM for Pixel. And one of my colleagues right now, who some of the people here have worked with, Ed Jiang. I think both these people, what I really admired about them was how deeply they got into the user's shoes and really sort of thought about it from that perspective. In a way where they almost seem to like live and breathe that particular user. And that sort of, I think, makes them incredibly gifted consumer people. But if I think back to like why their consumer insights are so powerful, I think it's because they've, over the years, they obviously started off with a very good talent at this and a knack at this. But over the years, they became very, very good at sort of just getting into the user's mind and being able to live the user's mind and being able to think like what would really simplify the product to work well for the user. And these are 2 of the best consumer PMs I've worked with.
Incredible. Caesar, let's take a journey a little bit forward towards like you conceiving the idea of Arbo and thinking through like what's your next chapter in life is going to look like. What were some of the decisions that you made? You had one of the most successful careers of most PMs at Google. You spend more than a decade there, and then like doing the thinking about like what the next journey is going to look like wouldn't be an easy decision. So can you walk us through some of the early conversation that you had and then leading to how you decided to finally leave and start this?
Yeah, so look, I've been thinking about I like doing early stage products and getting stuff off the ground and getting those going. So that had always been at the back of my mind. And I've been very fortunate that after doing Chrome OS, NBU was a similar opportunity where we got to build, like really think about stuff from scratch. So I've been thinking about that. But one of the things that happened was, the whole as I got into fintech over the last 5-6 years, and not just me, but a bunch of us who've started Arbo, most of us had not dealt with fintech till like 2015, 2016. But we realized how big a change this is going to be in the world. Like, even though fintech is big now, it's actually just scratching the surface. You look at like industries like finance and health and food production tend to be like the biggest industries in the world. And that whole space has really not had as much of technological change or user experience change that it needs to. So for a while, we kept thinking like, this is something that we want to do. And we realized like, it's going to be much faster to do it actually as a startup than sort of with the trying to do it inside Google, where there are advantages of doing it in a large company, but it's going to be very hard to go sort of at the core of finance when you're inside Google, right? It's just not part of Google's charter. And so when we decided to leave, the reality was a bunch of us actually didn't know specifically what we were going to do. But the key insight for us was that the finance space is massive. Technology, and particularly AI and machine learning, have not been applied at scale here, nor have great consumer experiences been prioritized. And so if you can bring like these two things together to the world of finance, you can actually create the kind of experiences that we're all used to seeing from regular consumer products, but in the financial space. And so all of us, when we left, we actually spent a bunch of time thinking about, like, with this insight, what is the big open problem that we can go crack that will really help us have drive profound change. It was very similar in a way, like when we did NBU, a lot of the products, we actually sat down, thought about core principles and foundational aspects of these countries or these people, and then came up with the products, right? And we built 5 or 6, 3 were very successful, 3 didn't work, but all of them came from these core foundational needs. And so we went through the same kind of process before deciding like exactly what to focus on for ArborWorks.
Amazing. Chris, are you back?
I am back. Clearly, I should have used Chrome, not Zoom, right? I should have definitely used Hangout. So sorry, everyone.
Well, you also probably used a Mac. You probably used a Mac, which took you 3 minutes to boot up. If you were on a Chromebook, it would have taken you 30 seconds.
Exactly. Sorry, Kush. This reminds me of a question that one of Caesar's old friends, Randy, submitted. So Caesar, he was asking home scaling pay, successful launching TES compares to your current startup leading teams in APAC and the US. Can you contrast and discuss how different it is? Any things you could share with people who perhaps are transitioning from one to the other as well?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. I think TES and NBU was a lot more similar to a startup than sort of Google Pay in the US. So let me contrast like those 3 in a way. So, Google Pay, US or other markets, like a larger company just had to deal with a lot of, I would say, obviously internal company issues, but also external company challenges, right? You have to solve for, like, Google is held up to a different standard in terms of privacy, in terms of legal requirements, in terms of like what you have to do for compliance. So it's just like pretty hard to build a product. Right? It's much harder to build a product. Like compared to that, for example, when we were launching most of the NBU products in the markets, we could focus a lot more purely on the user need rather than like sort of navigating the complex world that Google lives in today. Huge advantages of coming out with Google. Like one of the products that we did, we actually experimented at Google launching in Philippines, and in a sort of fake way, we called it Triangle, and we had more than 500,000 users. Now, any startup that accidentally gets 500,000 users will be a very, very successful startup. But for Google, that's just an experiment. So I think there are positives and negatives. At a startup, I think one of the biggest changes is the speed at which you can move and how fast you can make decisions. And the second thing that is super exciting is your ability to focus on purely the product and the user. So right now, for example, I would say, one of the people ask, like, are you busier at Google or busier at a startup? I tend to find I'm equally busy, but the mix of work, now I'm spending like 95% of my time on actual product and building a company, right? Versus sort of a lot of the procedural stuff that you have to do at a larger company. So I think that's one of the biggest changes. Having said that, I would say, look, you get, if you're at an early stage in your career, you're looking to get more structured mentorship learning, you would definitely get that much more in a larger company. A startup is much more for people who are willing to sort of jump in and take a big, basically try and learn by doing.
Thank you. I do want to dig deep in what you had mentioned about working in terms of startups, but also you had mentioned some of the learnings you have working globally. As you mentioned, you followed your wife around the world, but for folks who are joining from Silicon Valley versus Singapore and other parts of the world, can you compare and contrast? Should people perhaps looking at going to Singapore to get a few years of work experience? Should they stay in the Valley? How should someone think about their experience and their careers as someone who's, from your perspective, you have teams in both countries?
I think it depends. It depends actually on what type of role and what you want your craft to be, right? What skill sets are you trying to polish? If you want to be a phenomenal engineer, right? It's actually good to find a great company like Google or Facebook where you learn how to be a phenomenal engineer. You learn how to build highly scalable systems. You learn, machine learning at a pretty high scale. But if you're building sort of products and you're excited about serving users, man, people need to get to Asia. Doesn't matter where in Asia, but Asia is just so much more exciting at this point than what you will get in the Valley. With all due respect, like I felt like, when I moved back to Singapore, like I had come out of a bubble. And Silicon Valley does sort of create this little bubble around you. But, being in Asia, you just get to see the speed and the change and just an amount of like interesting problems to tackle. So I think that's one of the big reasons, especially if you're early on in your career, like spending a couple of years in Asia could be, could be Singapore, could be Shanghai, could be India, could be Philippines, Pakistan, anywhere. You'll get like a phenomenal front row, like opportunity to a very dynamic space. I think the Bay Area was probably like that in 99, 2000, but it's sort of a little bit more, sort of exciting from a pure consumer product point of view to be in Asia at this point.
And you've had first-hand experience making the investments on behalf of Google into some of the top startups in India, as well as in Indonesia and other parts of Asia. Any tidbits in terms of where should someone look at launching a consumer startup? Is it India? Is it Indonesia? Where are some markets that perhaps are less tapped today?
I think, look, at this point, every market is tapped. My sense is the right way to think about launching a product rather than looking from a pure country lens is to think about where is your product going to add the most value, right? So Arbo, for example, we're going to launch in the US first, right? Because we think that's where we'll be able to add most value. But there are other types of products where your product may work much better in India or Indonesia or any one of the larger markets. I think it's worth thinking about like the size of the market, but that comes after sort of you feel like this is where your product or your work is going to have the most value.
Great. I want to ask you a more generic question afterwards about career advice for the audience here. But before that, I want to make sure we also cover some of your advice for managers. Like, what are some great questions you've asked for people at Google when you were hiring them to your teams, but perhaps even now at your startup? Are there specific questions, and how do you essentially cater to where they're located, their background experience? What advice do you have for managers, Caesar?
I don't know whether this is advice for managers, but it's sort of a rule that I sort of go by, which is I kind of only want to hire people who I feel like I'll be happy working for. Right. So I think Mark Zuckerberg had a great quote around this or something. I don't know the exact quote, but when I read it, it resonated a lot with me because I kind of want to work with people for a very long time. And this, again, to go back to career advice, right? I'd go back, like the one thing that's worked really well for me, I kind of drifted into it, but now I've made it a rule. I'm only going to work with people I feel like who I think have a probability of working with for a very long time. I want to commit myself to those long-term relationships, and I want people who commit themselves to long-term relationships, because relationships, like many things, compound over time, and you start doing incredible stuff when you work together for a long time. So again, in Arbo, for example, a lot of us have worked together 14, 15 years. And so sometimes it feels like, siblings, who remember fights from 14 years back. But it also means that, your level of trust and the level of like speed at which you can get things done dramatically improves over anything else. So that I would say as a manager or anyone else, like the right thing to think about is to how to create these types of relationships and how to create a team that feels like it's going to stay together for a very long time. I'd say if you had asked me who I want to, like, why am I doing Arbo? One of the primary reasons is because these are the people I wanted to work with. It almost didn't matter what the problem set was. The first question was, these are the people I want to work with. And that's why we are doing this together.
It's awesome. So folks, if you have questions, start typing it into the chat or raise your hand over there. I think the first question I do want to get asked from, though, Ben, I'll give you a heads up before I ask one more question to Caesar. Ben, since you've worked with Caesar for so long, what hasn't he shared yet that you would want him to share with everyone? So think about that. Caesar, what other career advice have we not covered that you think that the audience should learn from you?
I think a couple of things. I think first was, I don't know if I stressed on the people part in a big enough way. If there's one thing you can get right about your career, it's to find the right people to work with. Because if you find people who are better than you, who excite you, who recharge you, and like help you improve every single day, you've solved almost all of your career questions. Promotions don't matter, projects matter less, people you work with matter sort of the most. Then the second thing I would probably emphasize on this is when it comes to people, people often underestimate the importance of creating mentors for yourself. And so this is something like very early on, like one of my first managers at Google was a guy called Mario Quiroz. Some of you guys may have worked with him. And when we were all junior PMs in London, every time we visited Mountain View, he would basically introduce us to one other person and say, I want you to go meet this person in Mountain View. Could be Sundar, it could be like other superstar PMs at that time, like Gokul or Susan or others, and say, try to see if they're willing to mentor you. And it was one of those things that I think I've tried to hold on to even in my career right now, which is always looking for people you can learn from and who can mentor you. And that's a phenomenal way to eventually end up, creating sponsors for yourself. Like a lot of our angels on Arbo are people who've mentored us, one of my co-founders, who've been our sponsors over the last decade or so. So that is one aspect around career development that I think often gets overlooked and I think can be very, very powerful.
Last question before I turn over to Ben. With that, all those people you mentioned are always very busy. Have you found a way to ask someone to mentor you without putting them on the spot? Is there a way to structure that relationship? Or
look, I think you don't have to start off by putting the mentorship question right on them, right? Because that puts a lot of load on someone. You can just reach out to them and say, hey, can I get some time for you? I'd love your advice. And some of it you have to see if it naturally develops, right? Like if it naturally develops into that chemistry where you feel like you have the opportunity to create a long-term relationship. And then you keep coming back on questions. You remember what are the things they've said. You try to take that seriously, and out of the number of those conversations, you'll find some that will really turn into long-term mentorship relationships.
That's incredible. Thank you. Ben, are you ready with your question?
Sure, I can ask a question. So some of the inflections.
This is so unfair.
What?
This is so unfair because you know so much about me.
Also, I got a message from John Fu, who's listening too. So way back in the old Chromebook days, he's on the call too. Question for you. So some of the inflection points where next steps maybe weren't as obvious. So I think like when you moved from looking after Chrome OS to starting the NBU team, how did you navigate those? And I mean, I know that you had a pretty clear set of guiding principles in terms of moving with family and having that be one of the key considerations. But how did you kind of think about different options that might be on the table, whether inside or outside of Google, and navigate those sorts of conversations and the transitions as you went through that?
Wow, that's a tough question. I can talk about my process, and Ben, you probably saw a little bit of it personally. So you can hold me if I'm like doing revisionist history or not. You can hold me.
That's actually why I'm curious, because I think I got like some snapshot of it, but I'd be curious to see what was going on in your head too.
So the reality is, look, I wanted to move back to Asia because my wife wanted to move back.
Yeah.
And, I had a choice of like either continuing to work on that or move here. And I wasn't, to be absolutely candid, I was quite scared of moving at that point to Singapore because I knew nothing about the space. But I think I give credit to Sundar. He dragged me onto a project called Android One to help the Android team. And also on Android One, I managed to convince Ben and Ed and Dave and a couple of other people who we're still working together to jump onto Android One. And I think that was a moment of like basically starting to engage, or, I grew up in India, but to re-engage really to understand India, Indonesia, Turkey, all the NBU markets. So I guess my thing was I was open to possibility. And because Sundar had, like, I could not have left Google without him being okay with it. And he had told me he wasn't going to let me leave for a year. I kind of had to kind of go through it. But I think for me, what worked out was, again, I don't think I'd have been able to do it if you guys hadn't jumped on, right? Like it would just have been too exhausting. But it was really fun. And it made me remember like sort of how the early days of Chrome OS and, us having very few resources, but being very creative and just sort of, being very focused on doing like something cool and interesting. And that sort of got me really excited. So I've kind of always focused on things which I've felt like I'm not going to regret doing later. That, and I felt like, again, Android One and eventually Android One, sort of morphed into NBU when we realized it's actually much bigger than just phones. It's actually the software experience on it, the apps, and then we got into like Station and Access and all sorts of stuff. It was more because I looked back and I realized at that point, as we were going through it, we all collectively realized that this is a massive opportunity. And I think as we started feeding that back to Google and helping the rest of Google understand, I think for a period of time now, I don't know if it's still true, but all of Google seemed to echo the sense of excitement and the possibility that we found in the next billion years of markets.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Great question. Anurad, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hey, Caesar, how are you doing?
Yeah, I know.
Quick question for you, actually. I'm curious, seeing as I'm also kind of doing my own startup after Google, how's the culture at Arbo? Like Google obviously has this great culture. We've got a lot of people from Google who've jumped on with you. I'm curious to know what culture at Arbo is like, and in particular, what you were doing differently to Google, and why.
So we actually have a culture doc that we published, which is based again on an exercise that Ben and I think Dave Shapiro is also on the call here. Ben, Dave, Ed, we wrote up an NBU. Like when we started NBUs, we said, what kind of a culture do we want to create? And one of the things we wanted to do was to sort of try to get back a little bit of that early Google culture. Again, a sense of possibility, a sense of being in things together, sort of a more of a mission-driven approach, which wasn't about ego or promotions or what we're doing around career, but much more like, we have an incredible opportunity to do this. Let's actually go do it in a more responsible sense. A lot of humility. So for Arbo, Dave, myself, a few others, we did this same exercise. We actually early on got together and said, what kind of a culture do we want to create? And if you look at the only resource we've sort of published, it's actually a culture deck. So if you go look at our blog post, there's a culture deck that's linked to it. So we try to hold on to that. We try to make sure like we're calling ourselves out when we veer from the culture, because the culture is a very living thing. And in terms of what we've tried to bring from Google and what we've not tried to bring, we're very deliberate about it. So often we'll find ourselves asking us, each other, like, are we doing it because we are at Google, or are we saying this because we are at Google, or, are we behaving differently, or should we be doing it differently? Because again, there's a lot of great stuff at Google that we should bring, but there's some stuff that that only works in a large company, or that you should not get in a smaller company. So we've tried to keep that same sort of spirit of getting things done, really being in this together, having a sense of humility and hunger about what we're doing, and then just being actually really driven by the excitement of the opportunity and the fact that we're on this mission together.
Great. Ved, you're next with your question. Thank you.
Hi, Caesar. Hi. I don't know if you remember me, but I bought your car when you left US, and I followed you to I followed you to Singapore.
Thank you. I didn't recognize you. I hope it worked out fine.
Yes, it did. It did, and I sold it to another Googler before I left.
This is one of those amazing things for people who haven't realized. Like, Google was the only place where you could send an email out, leave your car keys on the desk. Somebody would come, take the car key, go, and then just basically write your check. The fastest and the easiest way to sell a car ever.
That's true. That's true. So my question is about frustrations, right? I mean, there are many frustrations in a large company where your ideas may not see the light of the day. And how has that changed for you at Arbo?
I mean, look, I mean, obviously, in a startup, in terms of like people having ideas, like there are always going to be a subset of ideas that you can actually work on as a group. And very often, you'll have to make a call on like, you might be very excited about an idea, but if it's not resonating with the overall group, you kind of have to step back. I think that's the right approach overall. We actually have a cultural phrase which we started off at NBU and then we brought to Arbo, which we call disagree and commit. And so very recently, like we had a debate and Dave actually explicitly mailed like a bunch of people and said, I disagree with it violently and vehemently and passionately, but I'm going to commit to it. And that is, that's been one of those things. I think the key thing to look at is like, are you feeling like you're learning or you're being fulfilled in the role you're in, right? And my argument would be whether it's a large company or a startup, life is way too short to just be doing something for the sake of doing it. Now, I realize I'm speaking from a privileged point of view, but even early on, like I learned like your time is actually the most precious thing we have on earth, right? And there's no point wasting it in a place where you feel you're not learning or you're not being valued. Now, that's true as much for a large company as it is for a startup. And so I think that I've always held true. And my submission would be that's probably one of the most important metrics to hold true when you're evaluating, large company, startup, one group versus another.
Caesar, just on that, I want to double click on this decision-making process. You did mention time is the most valuable thing. So we want to make sure we're spending in the most valuable thing we feel that we should be working on. But how do you not have paralysis on that? Do you give yourself a time limit? Do you have a process? What advice do you have for folks?
So hard because I generally tend to be a pretty intuitive person. And so I go a lot with what feels right in terms of my own time, what I'm excited about. But again, the answer becomes much easier when you're working with a set of people who you really just want to hang out with and work with, because collectively often again, the idea becomes less important than like this group that you're working with and creating something together.
Thank you. Boo Valley Roadhouse, it's your turn for your question.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I realized I logged in through my restaurant's Zoom, but so my question, hi Caesar, we met a long time ago. I don't expect you to remember me, but I'm curious about what you said with following people, right? Going with people that you're connected to. I used to say in college, like you take the class for the professor, you don't take the class for the topic, right? And I kept repeating that to all my friends as I would move around Google and join a new team that I was really excited about the management of. And then that management would leave in 3 months and 6 months and less than a year to do whatever other cool thing, not because they hated the team or because it was bad or anything, but suddenly this person that I was joining for had disappeared. And not having a network of 60 of those people like maybe you do, I'm curious how you approach those situations where you've entered for a person and the person goes away. I'm just curious about it. That's all.
I mean, look, I guess I've been very fortunate in life that like the groups have ended up joining haven't had as much churn, right? I do agree that of late at Google, there's a lot more movement and churn, right? It's just harder to find groups like that. But the reason I said this was the way I learned about this was, one of the things I learned in the Valley when I was studying there, when I was at grad school, and then later on was, you would often see these groups of people come together and they would do multiple companies, right? Like one of our co-founders, Felix, and Linus, who's still at Google, started 2 or 3 companies together, right? And a bunch of the people they worked with basically all started companies together. So often it may not just be the project, but like identifying these sort of people that you eventually want to work with together, and then sort of letting the universe do its magic and seeing if you all end up together in the right place. So I often sort of keep a mental list of people I would love to work with. So, I briefly talked about my Standard Chartered internship experience, hated banking, hated consulting, but I really liked the manager I worked with. And eventually she ended up joining us on Google Pay, on Pays in India. This is Diana Layfield, who's still at Google. And there was this period of like maybe 13 years in the middle that we didn't work together or something, or, 11, 12 years, but we stayed in touch and we would meet from time to time. And so when we were doing Pays and we realized, wow, we need like a really seasoned finance professional to go in and help us, lead us in this direction, like I kind of had an existing relationship with someone I could call and who I would love to work with. And so that's another way to look at it, is not just try to form these people that you would think are your tribe. And then eventually, life is long, you will get a chance to like get together with them. And once you've got together, then, you can sort of hopefully keep rolling together rather than sort of being separated out.
Thank you.
Great. Guru, why don't you go next? And Rachel.
Hi, Caesar. Pangu. It's been a while since we chatted.
Hey, Pangu. Why do I feel like it's all these people I've worked with for a long time who are asking me career questions? Should I be worried?
Oh, no. So I wanted to ask you a very light question. Okay. What did you think you would miss from Google when you left, and what do you actually miss?
So actually, I'll tell you what I still do miss. I do miss the people. So I think one of the things is, if you think, again, I do realize I had a very weird experience because I was at Google for 15 years, right? Like that's longer than I've been in any institution in my life, right? And so a lot of my friends, like it still feels like family. It feels like going back home. So I do miss that on a regular basis. I miss like being able to walk around the halls and just running into people and catching up, even if I'm not working with them. But I think the stuff that you really miss, actually, when you're building a startup, there's just so much you can take for granted at Google in terms of infrastructure, in terms of, and infrastructure, I don't just mean technical infrastructure. It could be aspects of marketing, sales, others. I mean, this is what large companies eventually build up. Their core strength is actually not the core product focus. It's all this other infrastructure that can be easily leveraged, and at a startup, we have to build all of that. And you have to develop that. You have to learn how to right now, if we have something we need to be done, there is no team to go talk to. Like we do it, right? Like we're the ones doing it. And that could be like, I was joking, in a startup, like the person who changes the toilet paper and the person who makes funding decisions are the same, right? Like you kind of have to do all those kinds of things. You had when we moved into our Singapore office, Ed was the one who went around doing all the lighting, because we could have found an electrician, but it was faster and easier and, to do this. It wasn't just money. So I think that's a big, big difference that you don't realize you'll miss, but you do realize once you come to a startup, it is different.
Thanks.
Rachel.
So I was wondering, do you have tips on navigating a large company with, very super talented people who might not have startup ambitions?
I think the best one I would say is form relationships before you need them. So depending on and the interesting thing about a company like Google is people are really nice, in general. And so if you reach out to someone and say, I'd love to get coffee with you, and do you have 30 minutes in the next 3-4 weeks? You'll see a vast majority of people actually say yes. And I think that like forming those relationships actually really helps you navigate across when you need it. And that doesn't have to be within, say, you're a PM, but doesn't have to be within the product org. It could be with engineering, it could be with legal, it could be marketing. And it just helps you understand the company and understand the people a lot better. I think that would be my suggestion.
Let's go with John, then Luis, and then I'll have a final question. John.
Hi, Caesar.
Hey, John, how are you?
Good. Wait, hold on a sec. I'm getting a massive echo. Okay, it's better. So, and now I have no audio. One second.
We can hear you.
Okay. So my question is, so right now I'm at Indeed, and I'm working on I'm helping run their incubator. And you were mentioning, doing next billion users at Google, trying to do innovative stuff, but like you're still part of this big company. So you have this weight of all this like procedural stuff, organizational stuff, meetings, performance reviews, all this kind of stuff. So how do you try to keep that balance, right? You're talking about, startup is the complete opposite direction. It's like all product all the time. And so how do you find that good balance? Do you just ignore stuff? Or like, how do you get through that?
You mean within the large company context, or
within the large company context? Within the large company context, how do you find the right balance of trying to do innovative stuff, but then like, you still got kind of a lot of like obligation stuff. It's like, oh, fill out this form, watch this training, sit in this meeting for 8 hours, right?
Look, some of that you just have to deal with as a tax, so that you can, have like, you can be a small team and yet have the power of Google behind you. Right? Like, when we launched Tez, we had the finance minister of India launching it. We had like, God knows gazillion articles written about it. As a startup, it's going to be much harder for us to do a lot of that stuff, right? So you just have these advantages and you think of it as a tax. I do feel NBU was a little bit odd because we were set up very independently, and also we were not in some of the more complicated markets of the world. Like I think US is just complicated, very complicated right now for tech, right? This is another thing that people will find when they come to Singapore or in Asia. There's a lot of like cultural issues that are coming into tech and product building that just make building stuff harder, right? Because that's much more sort of amplified in a way in the US than sort of in many of the markets where there's still a lot of user growth happening and people are focused on bringing people onto different platforms and online. And so I think NBU, we got away with that, but otherwise, like, Dave, myself, a bunch of other people, we tried our best to like keep as much of the bureaucracy away from the team. I don't think we were always successful, but it was a very conscious effort to try to fight and abstract the team from as much of the large company-ness as we could.
And Luis, final question from the audience.
No pressure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Hey, Caesar. So I'm Luis. I'm currently a product manager at Google. I'm really excited to be able to get access to this meeting because I think before I was able to transition to PM, I think I don't want to say harassed, but I talked to so many team members of that old GPay team to try to get a rotation in there, including Ben in Australia and Anu in Singapore. Didn't make it, but I make it to PM, so I'm excited. So I wanted to ask you, thank you. So I wanted to ask you, I've also tried to do what you said, like, hey, just try to talk to these people that you think is great PMs and connect with them and try to find mentorship. The highlight of my attempts were I got a one-on-one with Hiroshi because I went to a talk that nobody went. Everybody was live stream, so I was like, hey, you want to talk? So that's good, but otherwise I failed for the most part. So was there any of your attempts to these great PMs? Did you do something different that worked in that moment that you can recall and maybe advise me to try to do at Google?
So look, I mean, I've had a number of people just basically not show up, right? Or people saying, I can't do it right now. So in a way, you kind of have to be okay with some number of people saying no. But again, I would say, it's one of those things. It's a question you're asking for life. And if you've decided you're going to do something, you kind of, in a way, have to be okay with some of those disappointments. And I would say, look, today Google is pretty busy. You did manage to get time with one of the most busy people at Google, Hiroshi, which is pretty remarkable. And you probably, hopefully, got some great insights out of it. So I would say, in some of these things, don't lose heart. Like, it's a matter of time to find somebody good. Also, another way to think about it is like, how can you help them? So even when you're going into a call, if there's ways in which you can figure out how to help somebody and you've done a little bit of research on what they're doing, that's always another opportunity. I mean, one of the things I've learned a lot from one of my colleagues, Dave, is he thinks about how like he can add value to every call. How can every call every meeting be like valuable and good for everybody? I think that's another great approach to bring to these kinds of like cold outreaches.
That's a great
Awesome,
segue to
thank
the
you.
final question, Caesar. So the final question is, we know AlboWorks is still a stealth startup. Is there anything you can share or can share more than what you've already shared? And how can the Zoogla community be helpful to you as you continue to build it?
Thank you, Chris. I think the highlight of what we're able to share at this point is, look, we are thinking of trying to apply tech and great consumer experiences in a very profound way to finance and to a pretty big part of consumer finance. I think the product we're building is going to work very, very well, especially for Zooglers and for a lot of Googlers. So what we are getting pretty close to launching in the next couple of months. So very soon you'll hear from me on like if you want to try the product out and if you want to like kind of be an early user and help us improve it. And so I would be very grateful if like Googlers were to like help us improve the product by joining early, if they can help us amplify the news, or just give us feedback and ideas as we get going on this journey.
Great. On that note, Caesar, thank you so much for giving up your morning time in Singapore and sharing these great career development tips as well as insights. We appreciate the time, and thank you all for joining and being part of the Zoogla community. Based on all the questions and also your attendance here today, we're forming a stronger community. So thank you all for being a part of it, and hope to see you at another one of our events soon. Thank you, Caesar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you all.
Thank you.